Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Tech Tea Time. It's episode 3, it's our final. It's short before Hannover Messe. And this is why we meet here. This is what we discuss. We discuss the hot topics of the manufacturing industry. And before I forget, if you don't have a ticket for Hannover Messe yet, please get your ticket here and also book one of the sessions that fit to your needs. And this is also why I have Christian Maasem with me. He's Partner Connected Industry at Detecon GmbH, a subsidiary of T-Systems. Christian, thanks for being with me here.
Yeah, very much looking forward to round 3.
Round 3 opening now. Short recap. We were discussing in the previous 2 episodes about 5G in combination with cloud, what it means to get the data productive. That means data privacy and also data sovereignty. And now we're talking about data ecosystems. That means we're entering the Champions League finals. And that would be interesting to understand a little bit more what it actually means from your perspective, Christian.
Yeah, basically now we're talking about creating information value, or at least looking at it on a global scale, since we are tackling our global value and supply chains. Since they got interrupted in the former crisis and the current crisis we are seeing, might it be about the chipsets, war, corona, we've seen it all, and always have to feel it, actually, in terms of prices, in terms of products not there and available as we are used to. And always this question somewhere in the back of our head, couldn't they have done something about it? Surely we must be further than that, now shooting for Moon and Mars. And yeah, there we have our answer.
Okay.
Data ecosystems.
Oh, that's simple. That's perfect. We have another statement from your colleague, Dr. Jürgen Pattberg. He's managing partner at Detecon and a global executive board member responsible for the area of automotive and manufacturing industries. Let's see what he is saying on the topic.
The last 2 years have dramatically shown how weak our global supply chains are. The corona pandemic, the current war in Ukraine, or also the chip crisis has shown that issues in the supply chain lead to a complete standstill of production lines worldwide. Obviously, the answer cannot be to only produce locally, both from a supplier side as well as from the customer market. That's not the solution. The solution must be to improve the transparency throughout the whole supply chain. And this can be done by exchanging data, not only between the 2 partners who are directly interacting along the value chain, but throughout the whole value chain. Catena X is an initiative who wants to provide such a data space or such a data ecosystem where all the actors in the supply chain can mutually exchange the data, reveal things, issues earlier so that they can react on that more easier and much earlier. On top of the technological things that needs to be done for connectivity and interchanging data, we need to build up a culture of trust to exchange these data. So a lot of things to do, and let's use the opportunity here on the Hannover Fair to start the dialogue how we can support you in becoming member of the Catena X network. Looking forward to seeing you.
Now, Christian, from my opinion, that was really clear why it is important to discuss about the topic, why we shall go for the Moon and for the Mars. But the big question here is, how do we start the roadmap and which are the milestones to achieve it?
Actually, we should be all working on it already, since information is valuable also within the company, not only when we share it with others. But the consequences, not only on the global scale there, but already earlier we saw, following things like the bullwhip effect in logistics, in the supply chain, when offering and demand never were on the same page. So I always had too much on stock or had to sell for too low prices in the end. Situations never optimal, never efficient, and most likely also not sustainable, because I'm wasting a lot of resources investing in it.
Okay, so if this is not enough, just let's draw a little picture. What would happen if I decide that I won't go down that road? I'm skeptical. I don't believe in this concept or in this development. Is there actually any option to leave this away, or would that have real fatal consequences, most probably?
As everything in life, there's an option, but the question is, does it come with a due date you might regret later on not acting upon? As said, you can have benefits already when you do it on your own. That's fine. But in a global game, in a game of value and a supply chain, there are others on the left and right of Europe's who might decide to follow a certain road, to follow certain standards, and might not want to work or play with someone who doesn't. So in that regard, that might be a scenario you might be facing, not going along in the end, not being part of it, and having to run the show on your own, which is never that successful in the end. But I would rather go with potentials on the other side, what you can get out of it.
And that said, talking about standards and also combined with the term of global standards, there has to be some framework or some like kind of common understanding about how these things should work together. And it was already mentioned, like Catena X. This is one part of the standards. We're gonna look a bit closer into this a little bit later, but I assume that this is not the only framework or the only standard that is important here. About what different standards are we talking as well?
There are others we might not have associated with it, which are basically giving us this kind of global structure for scalability and so on. It came with the cloud age and with the hyperscalers we have, because they offer you, for example, IoT solutions you can build on very small initial beginning and scale it to the moon, actually. So they might be the ones forming a pseudo standard, a proprietary standard in the end, the same as with Azure, Microsoft, and the others, you will see. And now, within the last years, we saw also a counter movement, so to say, on the European level, aiming for a more open approach.
Mm-hmm. And this more open approach means also that we're looking back to episode 2 when we were talking about data sovereignty. And this is exactly where it would happen or where it would matter, right? So I think the European answer on these more proprietary approaches would be Gaia X, isn't it?
Exactly. We would see Gaia X basically as a more open foundation with basic services to exchange information, to have this kind of interoperability on a decentral scale we are looking for. And on top of that, you would find what you also mentioned before, the data models for data sovereignty, because you want to still be in charge of your data, especially now when it's becoming a kind of production asset you're actually holding with a real value attached to it. So you want to also decide, as you do with your products, to what price are you selling to whom, and who shouldn't get access to it while just climbing over the fence. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm. And sticking with the standards and the idea of data that has so many different formats, while we have on top of the discussion talking about frameworks and standards an idea like Catena X, then we have at the bottom line kind of Gaia X. Who's responsible about the standards, about the idea of interoperability here?
Yeah, the responsibles are not single institutions in that regard. It's also an open approach there because you have a consortia. You have a consortia of partners who are basically sitting in the same boat and realized the importance of data. So one came on a more on a wider level when we talk about Gaia X, this European initiative, driven and inviting basically everyone connected to data, to cloud, and so on, to form a kind of alliance, how to do it, how to exchange data in the best possible way, how to scale these services required for that. And on top of that, we found other initiatives, also with different consortia, still on the more generic level, because we're not talking about certain industries in that regard, just about the basic framework and infrastructure to build upon. So the International Data Space Association was another creating a model for that, to realize data sovereignty. So you can take that and use it as a blueprint to build up on and use products basically following that scheme, the same with Gaia X. So you would have a foundation already up to the point where you have to figure out what domain am I in. If it's automotive, that might be easy. To go to our colleagues in our session and you talk Catena X, because there we have an alliance like that already in place. With others, they still have to be formed, but they can use potentially the same platforms so that they don't have to create their own.
And this is where it becomes really interesting, right? We're talking then about cross-industry collaboration and a potential that is mostly not used yet. And this is where we're entering now also the idea of the positive effect if I go down that road, because we've had the potential threats or the situations that become risky and tricky if we don't have these standards or these solutions in place. But let's talk about the value a bit more. What happens, what I could assume that will happen if I have achieved that status quo?
Yeah, I would say it might, in the end, be a similar impact to what we have seen with the internet, because that made not only the cat pictures available everywhere, but also just a bunch of knowledge which wasn't accessible. So for now, we had encyclopedias which weren't that filled to the rim with information. Okay, now we need to filter it, another point. But what we see with these data ecosystems, if done right, is basically the same for the business datascape.
So let's talk also about something that is put away many times and has been put away for a too long time, one could say, is the aspect of sustainability. Because we've seen that we need to act, we need to change many things. And with a little bit of fantasy, even if not going too deep here already, is that this might have a huge impact on the questions of sustainability and sustainable production as well, isn't it?
I definitely would say so, and that even on many different levels, actually, you could tackle with that if you just have a right kind of transparency alongside your chain. For example, about your product, might it be the windows, the microphone here in front of me, that I actually know how it's made, what went into it in terms of resources in the end. I might know how much CO2 it produced in its life cycle, also to the end, most likely. How does it compare, for example, to your microphone of a very same build, from the very same factory, but most likely with another carbon footprint in the end? That I only get to know if I have a whole chain from sourcing of materials to the production line, to the logistics, to the retail stores, and so on. Then I can really tell you how green a product was, for example, or also how bio is our food we actually get to the table, and did the money get where it should to the farmers raising the cattle and so on. Just a few of the examples in that realm.
And with a little bit more perspective on that, could this lead even to kind of a feedback loop while I'm having all the data available and all the rating potentials, kind of like how efficient is my production, how reliable is my traffic while delivering and all that, how sustainable is the product, since we could have all this information in place, right? I mean, for the final customer, but also within the supply chain. Do you think that this might lead also to kind of more progressive action in terms of what we need to change and where to change?
I think that might be rather started with a step-based approach, because no one will open their books completely from the very beginning, because there's, of course, risk involved, there's sensitive data, giving some insights into your production process, in your USPs you have maybe there. So that we won't see from the start. I don't know if and when we might see that to a certain extent, but we definitely will reach another level than now at the moment, because then everyone can produce more efficiently in terms of energy, in terms of resources, and has a bigger profit margin. I think there is inherent motivation to do so, and someone will do it, profit from it, and others will copy it. But if we have also overall benchmarking, which would be cool, but I won't think it will be that specific. It might be on a very rough level if it starts. We might have it due to regulations, maybe with a carbon footprint, which you have to announce. So that might be kind of benchmarking, but you never know when all the parameters and variables going into it, because it might depend on your whole supply chain. If you don't put that in, you can say, that producer is totally green, the other is not, and it was actually not his fault.
Yeah. And this is where it begins to make sense, right? And would be interesting for me to hear how far Catena-X is in this area already, because Catena-X is already like practicing it with the whole industry, which is a really complex industry, and that's most probably also why it serves as an example, and probably also in the future as a more generic idea of how things could work. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's a very good instance, since the automotive industry anyhow is quite often at the forefront of new technologies, of newer ideas, as we see it here with this data interoperability and exchange, because they understood there is quite some potential in sharing that information. It might be even needed to share that information to produce the products in the way we would be still able to afford them later on, or want to afford them. So we basically created their blueprint and used some foundations we talked about earlier with their use cases. So what might they be interested in is maybe traceability of a product, which is usually quite interesting. You might want to know about critical components like batteries. What kind of journey did they take in the life cycle? Is there a risk of self-inflammation or something like that? Which, of course, you want to avoid at all costs. So these are just some things you can only solve, you can only address when you cooperate and you share information. Maybe not all, that's why we have data sovereignty, but a certain amount of it to certain kind of people, to certain players in your supply, in your value chain. And then more than one can actually profit from it. And usually if everyone shares in that profit, it's a done deal.
It's a done deal. What an ending, Christian. I would take it as an ending, because there are so many important aspects here at Tech Tea Time, which should totally convince everyone to join you at Hannover Messe as well, because you will be there not only with your colleagues, but also with certain of the partners that we have discussed about right now. And I repeat myself, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have a ticket, if you didn't book your session yet, please do so right now and meet Christian and your colleagues at Hannover Messe. Have a great time. Christian, thank you so much for joining me. Goodbye.
Bye.